Welcome everyone to our event today titled Unfinished Business, Legal Immigration as a Strategic Refresh for Immigration Legislation. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown. I'm the Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you very much for joining us, and we invite you to engage with us on Twitter using the handle @BPC_bipartisan and the hashtag BPC Live, or in the comment section on our YouTube page for the event. Put your questions in these forums and we'll get to them toward the end of our discussion. Today's event is happening at an uncertain time for immigration. After various attempts at comprehensive immigration reform and smaller deals during the Trump administration to find permanent status for Dreamers and DACA recipients, Democrats are now trying to go it alone to include immigration in reconciliation. That effort is ongoing, and although not dead, true previous discussions with the Senate parliamentarian have indicated it will be a narrow window of opportunity if it happens. But more relevant to today's discussion is that the provisions being offered on reconciliation primarily would address some of the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country, including Dreamers, essential workers, and some others. Other language in the House bill would recapture unused family-sponsored and employment-based green cards from past years to try to address growing backlogs in the waiting times for legal immigrants. However, unlike past comprehensive immigration reform efforts, no major changes to the legal immigration system for family or work-based immigrants is proposed. And yet, BPC's polling with Morning Consult from May of this year showed that legal immigration reform, in other words, updating and refining our current green card and temporary visa systems, could be the most viable option for bipartisanship. It was the area that more Republicans and Democrats were willing to make compromises on to achieve change. So today we're going to look at the idea of legal immigration reform, what role it played in past legislative immigration reform efforts, the need for it now, how it might help address other issues at our border. And we are joined by several experts to see whether this idea might be a strategic refresh for legislative immigration reform. So with that, let me introduce our panelists who each come with a unique perspective on this issue. First up is Cesar Conda. Cesar is the founding principal and policy advisor at Navigators Global. He has been involved in immigration policy since the mid-1990s when he worked for former Senator Spencer Abraham of Michigan, who was then the chairman of the Senate Immigration Subcommittee. He was also a member of the Bush-Cheney White House policy team on immigration as an assistant for domestic policy to Vice President Cheney. And he was most recently on the Hill as chief of staff to Senator Marco Rubio during the 2013 Gang of Eight negotiations on comprehensive immigration reform. Since returning to Navigators, he'd worked for numerous clients on immigration issues, and Cesar has been in this fight probably about as long as I have, I think, at this point, through 7 or 8 attempts at comprehensive immigration reform. Leon Fresco, who is also joining us, is a partner at Holland and Knight, and he's an immigration attorney in their Washington, D.C. office. He was the primary drafter of that 2013 immigration reform effort in the Senate, S-744. When he was chief counsel for the Senate Judiciary Immigration Subcommittee under Senator Chuck Schumer. He's also served as a deputy assistant attorney general for the Office of Immigration Litigation at the Department of Justice during the Obama administration, defending the government in various immigration court cases. So we welcome Leon. Next, we have Sharvari Shev Dalal Dehaney, who is Director of Government Relations at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, otherwise known as AILA. The AILA is a voluntary nonpartisan bar association of more than 15,000 immigration attorneys and law professors. And in her role, Shev directs AILA's administrative and congressional advocacy efforts, focusing on employment-based immigration, immigration benefits, and the legal immigration system. And before joining AILA, she worked for 11 years in the Office of Chief Counsel at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And last but not least is Riva Restak. She is a research assistant at the Center for Global Development, working with noted researchers Michael Clements and Thomas Ginn, supporting their work on migration and displacement. Before joining CGD, she worked as an immigration paralegal and a research fellow for the Central America Monitor at the Washington Office for Latin America. And we welcome all of our panelists today. So let's get to it. So Cesar, I'm going to start with you. You were instrumental in the negotiations on the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Bill on behalf of Senator Marco Rubio, and you've had a front seat view of the changes to the Republican Party since then on this issue of immigration. So what's your perspective on where the party was in 2013, where the party is today, and what's driving it? And maybe most importantly, do you feel there's room for bipartisanship still, and where do you think that is?
First, thank you, Teresa, and thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for pulling together this event. I'm a big fan of your work and of my former colleague, Bill Hoagland. We used to work on the Senate Budget Committee back in the day, so a big fan of the BPC. To your question, you know, the Republican Party is much different than it was in 2013. It's, you know, the party has become more conservative, more working class, more populist, and less so sort of Chamber of Commerce like. And these changes have occurred rapidly. They actually started, I guess, in the late 2000s with the emergence of the Tea Party, which catapulted my former boss, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and others of that class of 2010 into the Senate. You know, I think that the change in the mix is going to make it harder, much harder to pass any type of immigration legislation going forward. But that's not to say it can't be done. I don't know if you all saw, but I think the Pew Foundation put out a survey on sort of the composition of the Republican Party today. It's basically made up of 3 or 4 groups. Let me just talk about a couple of them. The sort of faith and country Republicans and the working class populists, a lot of the new voters that came in under President Trump, have become almost the majority of the Republican voting base, which wasn't the case, you know, 10, 15 years ago. And their top issue is border security and combating illegal immigration. The Pew also identified a group called the Committed Conservatives, which are sort of your establishment Republicans who supported Ronald Reagan, business community, open to a discussion. I mean, this group is kind of open to a discussion on immigration reform, but it shrunk to about 15%, which points to the challenges that we have going forward on major immigration legislation. Today, Republican voters and independents have become angry and agitated about the border situation, illegal immigration, and it's been compounded by news reports, media reports about proposals to compensate immigrant families separated at the border, allowing some undocumented access to the child tax credit and so forth. Let me turn to some slides that I put together. These are taken from the Republican Senatorial Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee, which can give you a flavor about where the Republican voter base stands and, obviously where Republican politicians are going to go, because politicians are public policy entrepreneurs and they're going to go where their voters go. So can I have slide 1 first on the screen? Okay, great. So I won't go through these points, but this is a survey that was done November 2nd through November 4th by the NRCC on immigration. And as you can see, I won't go through a lot of these points, but let me just touch on a couple of them. 63% of voters, including, this is important, independents are mirroring what the Republican base is thinking on these topics. 63% of voters, including 72% of independents, oppose paying $450,000 to illegal immigrant who is separated from their child when illegally entering the United States. Now, President Biden said that there's no such proposal under consideration, but the White House has walked that back, and they obviously are considering something like that. A couple other points to point out as it relates to this discussion about legal immigration. 56% of voters, including 63% of independents, oppose giving legal status, work permits, federal benefits to foreign nationals who either cross the southern border or overstayed their visas. And then on the question of companies using legal immigrants to supplement or add to their workforce, you've got 53% of voters, including 55% of independents, opposing removing federal limits on the number of foreign workers who can be hired by corporations to do jobs based in the United States. So you'll see House Republicans, I mean, these are basically 2-to-1 issues, and House Republican with appeal to independence. You'll see House Republicans sort of focusing on that going into 2022. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides, next 3 slides, come from a National Republican senatorial survey of suburban battleground voters. And I won't go through these in detail, but the first one, you can see that the voters are placing blame on the immigration situation on the president and the administration. It's 56-39 overall. But if you look at the subgroups, you can see, obviously Democrats don't, Republicans do. Independents are assigning blame to the president, 55-38. And then over at the third column there, you see the suburban targets, which is going to be a key block for Republicans. You see they're placing, the blame clearly on the administration. Next slide, please. So the senatorial committee had a couple other questions on immigration, and you can see that they're testing some of these issues which Senate Republicans will be using in 2022. The immigrant vaccine issue. There was another question having to do with notification of relocation of undocumented immigrants, which again polled something like 80-20. So, I think those basic slides show that, Republicans going into 2022 will want to secure their base, right? And I think immigration, border security will be at the top of the list. And then they'll want to appeal to suburban voters through education, inflation, and cost of living issues. I've seen this. Inflation and immigration are the top issues I see in direct mail fundraising appeals, tweets, op-eds, advertising by Republicans, fundraising events that I've attended in person. I mean, those are going to be sort of the top issues going forward. So, I'll let others speak, but, my bottom line is, I become more pessimistic about the prospects for any immigration reform until the situation at the border is addressed, with the possible exception, and we'll go to the next slide, of addressing DACA recipients. It's the one area where even Trump voters are a majority support providing a earned pathway to citizenship for Dreamers and the DACA recipients. And we can talk about sort of the contours of what a deal might look like, but I think for Republicans on the Hill, and I've talked to many of them, any solution to address the Dreamers has to be accompanied by border security measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Caesar. So let's go to the other side of the aisle. And Leon, you sat in the chair opposite Caesar when you worked for Senator Schumer on the Senate Judiciary Committee during that time. How do you see the position of Democrats having changed in the intervening years? And we're focused here. I mean, Caesar talked a little bit about the border security issues, which are big, and legalization, which is big. But one of the things he didn't talk about is legal immigration. So, and I haven't seen the Democrats talk a lot about that either. So where do you feel that falls in?
Well, one could talk for hours on all of this, but I'll try to be very concise. I think if you want to take a fork in the road of time, and I think Caesar will actually be more familiar with this than me, I think you would take 2007 and you would take the immigration vote that happened in the 2007 bill, where you had an ample amount of Democrats who voted against the bill and an ample amount of Republicans who voted against the bill. And at that time, immigration wasn't yet the sort of hyper-partisan issue that it has become today, because there were people on both sides of the spectrum, particularly with this issue of legal immigration, where you had on the left, the sort of what I would call the labor left, and on the sort of what I would call the sort of nationalist right. Those coalitions would come together and they would say, on specifically issues of legal immigration, we don't want any of it in the United States because we view these legal pathways of legal immigration to be anti-American worker. And what we should be doing is on either both limiting those numbers, but focusing on things like job training or just finding some solution other than using immigration as a supplement to the workforce. Then what ends up happening, and people can have these debates, this is just my view, is in 2010, you have a bloodbath of Democrats in the Congress, with the exception of Michael Bennet in Colorado and Patty Murray in Washington and Harry Reid in Nevada. And people start saying, well, maybe this is because the Hispanic vote is actually an important cog in the Democratic coalition, and we need to be much more respectful of that voting cog than we had been in the past, where immigration up until then was viewed as this, again, more of a policy issue and less of a political issue. Now, it's always been a political issue since the 1800s. I'm not saying it hasn't been, but I'm saying there were still bipartisan coalitions on the anti-immigrant front and on the pro-immigrant front. You can have bipartisan coalitions in both. That changed after 2010, in my view, and was really mobilized in the 2012 presidential election, re-election. And then since then, it's become more of a factor, and then re-galvanized by President Trump in sort of having a counter theory that basically no matter how enforcement oriented you are on immigration, it won't change the Hispanic vote at all. It'll just keep it the same, and you'll get the same 30% you have whether you're George Bush Jr. or Donald Trump. You'll get the same level of support, but you might drive out some other people by being pro-immigration, or you might attract people by being anti-immigration. And so that's as far as I'm going to go on the political front. What that's meant on the immigration policy front is that Democrats have had a hard time getting a equilibrium that is sustainable for how they talk about immigration, because I think there had been a governing philosophy that had sort of made sense and continues to be mine, always makes sense to me, which is the sort of philosophy of the closed door with the wide gates phenomenon, where you wouldn't allow people to come in illegally, but you would have pathways. You would try to reform the law and change the laws so that anyone who would want to come illegally could find a venue to come legally, which doesn't exist today, as we all know. And I mean, as for the platform of today, I mean, all you have to do is you look at the JOLT survey of the Department of Labor, the job openings and labor turnover survey, and you look at the labor participation rate and the labor force, and you see there's a massive need for labor. You have companies all across America trying to figure out how they can get people from Afghanistan who barely have any acclimation to the United States into their companies because they're so dependent upon labor. I mean, they want American workers. They're doing things to get American workers, but they're also not getting sufficient number of American workers. And so they're trying any way they can to supplement their workforce. And that's what you're seeing now. I mean, that's going to be weighed against much longer term problems where, 20 years from now, if all humans are replaced by robots, why do you need immigration? So you can talk about that 20 years from now later, but the issue now is one of a labor demand need. And so the question is, who's talking about that? And politically, honestly, nobody's talking about that, because the Republicans are afraid to talk about that for the reason Caesar said. And the Democrats are afraid to talk about that because this isn't a natural fit for the Democratic coalition, which is solving a massive labor crisis problem that we're having vis-a-vis fixing the legal immigration system. That's just not part of the natural toolkit of the Democrats. And so instead, what's being discussed in the reconciliation package, even though there are legal immigration provisions in the reconciliation package, and I want to talk about those, but are the larger attempts to figure out how to deal with the undocumented population. And the question really moving forward is going to be, the trade has always been relatively simple. We are compassionate to the people already here in exchange for making sure we don't have a second wave of people that then make the problem come back in 20 years. And the question is if you don't do that second wave, what will the immigration system look like moving forward? And will it create a desert of immigration policy making that just continues to swing from one pendulum to the other, depending on who's president, with no congressional action? Or does it finally unlock the ability for Democrats to engage in border issues because now they've done something to address people without status? I can't really predict that, and I think it also will depend on how bad things get, both on the border and, God forbid, if things like terrorist activities happen or other things like that. All those things can change things in a minute, so you never know how those things will play into the equation. But from the legal immigration perspective, the one thing that the bill does do in the reconciliation moving forward is you recapture 400,000 visas, which helps reduce the backlog that you have, and you allow people to pay their way out of the immigration backlog. And if those provisions pass, which I hope to God they do, that will unleash a ton of human capital that is currently stuck in their particular job because they're on a visa that has them stuck there, that will unleash that group to invent things, start companies, hire workers, get all of those people out into their best maximization of their potential. And that will be a game changer economically. So from that perspective, I hope those provisions stay in no matter what. Obviously, the parliamentarian will have something to say about that, but those provisions like that were allowed in 2004, 2005. So I hope those provisions stay in, but a lot of this is going to depend on what happens on the fate of the undocumented. So sorry for that long-winded answer, but there you go.
No, Leon, that's great. So let me turn now to Chev. And Chev, working for AILA, you and your members see the totality of the immigration system, from asylum and refugees to deportation defense to work visas and family green cards. I would argue that no one is as familiar with how our immigration system actually works in practice than immigration lawyers. But increasingly, it seems like the legal immigration system just isn't working at all. So from your perspective, why is it important that we try to fix our legal immigration system? And what do you think are the biggest issues out there that need to be addressed?
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks everyone for having me. I think what we've highlighted here is really what is the problem, right? We hear a lot about providing pathways for citizenship for the undocumented, but the question really is why do individuals become undocumented, or do they fall out of the legal status? And really, it's because our immigration system is outdated, overly complex, and burdensome with like myriads of forms and difficult laws to understand and comply with. And that's things that immigration attorneys face every day with their clients. What is clear is that our legal immigration system is no longer reflective of the modern, and more so that's become clear in the past few years, virtual times that we live in. And it's not functioning in a way that facilitates the economic innovation and even the family unification that are important parts of what our immigration system can provide. What ends up happening is as people are navigating these complex systems and laws and just these incredible wait times that Leon alluded to, is that they're forced to make tough choices. They're falling out of status, they're being separated from their family members. And all of this a lot of times is when they're waiting for the next step in the legal immigration process. So for example, you're talking about an individual who has come here and wants to become a student, and they may have to wait for more than a year for their application to be adjudicated for them to be able to enroll and get that non-immigrant status as a student. As a parent of a junior in high school right now, I am learning the application process, and that moves fast. And no one's going to be waiting around for a year for you to be able to get your immigration in order. And that's a lot of innovation that's then lost. Another example that we see on a regular basis is individuals who have been living and working in the United States as professional workers on a visa like the H-1B, who have been sponsored for a green card for permanent residence by their employers, may have to wait decades, not just 1 year, 2 year, but multiple decades before they can get their immigrant visa and become a permanent resident, become a fully contributing member of our country. And it's only because of the annual limitations that have been placed on green cards in the system that we have. So to demonstrate that, it's, every year there are a total of 140,000 employment-based visas available each year. This is a limit set by Congress. This can go up and down, as we've seen in the last 2 years because of some movement, but typically it's set at 140,000 a year. But there are currently nearly 1 million people who have an approved employment-based immigrant visa petition. So that's getting your immigrant visa petition is the first step. That's where you prove that you can get the job, that you're not taking work away from a willing or available US worker. And then you have to wait for that number to become available. And that process between having an approved petition, where there's 1 million people who are currently sitting in line with an approved petition, to the time that they can actually get their green card is really factored in by only having a very limited number of visas available every year. And then this is compounded by the fact that individuals from certain countries like India or China are really impacted by per country limitations. The way the statute is set forth right now, every country is in general allowed 7% of the total population of visas that are available. So out of the 140,000, 7% goes to each country. There are some rules that, there's a little bit of flexibility there. But the idea is that the same limitation and the same percentage applies to individuals from India, a country with a population of more than 1 billion people, as it does to Monaco. So whereas a software engineer from a European country may have to wait, 5 years to get their green card, an individual from India who has the same skill set and the same type of job offer may have to wait 8 decades, as some sort of reports say, to get that immigrant visa. And I'm not sure about you, but even if I got that first job offer as a child, I don't want to be working when I'm 80. What does this mean while individuals have to wait for the immigrant visa number to become available? Is that some people will fall out of status while they're waiting. They're here on some kind of non-immigrant status. If they want to move jobs, it could be impacted by that, or that they're time limited. If you come on certain visas, that they're time limited and you have to leave before you're able to adjust your status to a permanent resident. But I think it's even more compelling is that a lot of these individuals' children who essentially have been raised in the United States and don't know other countries, age out of the process. When they turn 21, they can no longer ride on their parents' green card application, and they're out of status. And the question is, now what? What's next for them? They become what we refer to as legal dreamers, people who came here lawfully and have now fallen out of status because the immigration system is not working properly. Similarly, you've got people who are coming here as family-based immigrants, and they may have to make the tough choice about whether they're going to remain separated until they get their immigrant visa number, or make that unlawful trip across the border so that they can be reunited. They might have an approved family-based immigrant visa petition, but it could be decades before they can be reunited with their family, just as it is in the employment-based category. So, for example, the married adult child of a U.S. citizen could have to wait 20 years before he or she is reunited with his or her parents. And that's way too long to wait to see your family and to be with your parents or to be with your children. At this point, the estimate is that the family-based backlog of approved petitions, people who have already established their eligibility, is nearly 4 million people. And that's significant. Just think about that. 4 million people have approved petitions. They've established that they have the relationship that merits them under the current law to come to the United States. They're just waiting for that final step to get an immigrant visa number available to them so that they can actually come here. It's gotten, I think this is, and Leon talked about recapture. The worst part of the most recent years is that, while 5 million people wait for an immigrant visa number, hundreds of thousands of immigrant visa numbers have just gone to waste due to the pandemic, because the Department of State has been, offices overseas have been closed, because USCIS wasn't able to adjudicate carefully, or not carefully, sorry, as efficiently and as quickly as possible. Numbers just went to waste, numbers that Congress authorized. This isn't saying create new visas. This is Congress has authorized the availability of these numbers that go to waste because of administrative delays. And that's really just unconscionable, and it's really important, and it would make a big difference that if in budget reconciliation, they're able to recapture those hundreds of thousands of visas that have gone lost. The other thing is some of this is very preventable, right? one of the biggest problems our members face when their clients that they represent face are the delays in processing times with applications, right? It can take months, if not years, to get your application, even the first step of your application processed. And those processing times have increased significantly over the past 4 years. Over 100% increase in processing times just in the past since 2017. And I think that is really preventable, and Congress needs to make sure that those don't happen. You know, one of the things is agencies have to be able to process more efficiently without sacrificing integrity. And Congress can fund their modernization and backlog reduction efforts. And, you know, importantly, Congress can change the way how immigrant visas are allocated. You know, we could re-envision the entire system, but right now, and what's being discussed in budget reconciliation are some minor changes, but that would make a huge difference in the lives of these individuals and in our economy and in our social network, would make a significant difference right now. So, you know, those changes are important. I think, you know, as we're talking about what Leon mentioned, the budget reconciliation as a companion to the legalization efforts, we're looking at, you know, recapturing those unused visas, allowing individuals who have begun the green card process to adjust their status earlier and prevent them from falling out of status, and then funding USCIS and DOS to make sure that they can efficiently process those applications. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm looking forward to questions going forward.
Thanks so much, Chev. So Riva, let's turn to you. I mean, one of the things you've heard from Chev is that one of the motivations of people who might choose to come to the United States illegally or regular migration is this challenge of the legal immigration system. And your organization has looked at legal immigration in a different way, as in part as an antidote to irregular migration from developing countries, as well as a pathway to development for those same countries. So why do you think that providing more avenues for legal visas could be beneficial to the United States immigrants and those sending countries? And what do you think that could look like?
Sure, thank you. To start out, I appreciate this opportunity, and it's great to be on a panel with such esteemed experts as well. So I'm coming at this from an academic perspective. The Center for Global Development is an economic think tank. So I'll primarily be talking about demand and supply in terms of labor markets, particularly for employment-based visas. And I appreciate Leon's mention of demand. We do see in the Bureau of Labor Statistics that there will be 6 million net new jobs in the next 10 years. And so what the Center for Global Development is conceptualizing is how is that demand met with supply. Another trend that we see across high-income countries is the demographic decline among the populations, the native populations. So not just in the United States, but in a majority of high-income countries, actually, people are aging out of working age. Meanwhile, in low and middle income countries, we do see a growing population that's between that 18 to 64 years old. And so we see this spatial mismatch as an opportunity to make sure that both countries of origin and destination are having their needs met. I think we can all agree here too that the regularization or legal pathways offer an opportunity for the United States to know who's crossing the borders and do that in a managed and intentional way, particularly with regard to labor markets. The labor condition applications do have some flaws. I recognize that, but it's better to improve upon that system rather than the alternative of what we have right now, which is a black market for labor in which both host communities and migrants are at risk and not enjoying the benefits that they could from a regularized market. For migrants, obviously, if you have a regular pathway from the start, you have a trip on a plane, which is safe. It's often cheaper as well than the irregular route. And you're also not living in fear of deportation once you're in the host country. But what my organization primarily focuses on is the relationship between migration and development in countries of origin, and how those two can complement each other so that both countries of origin and destination can reap mutual benefits, given that this is a pattern, a demographic pattern that happens, whether regular or irregular. So something that my boss, Michael Clemens, has worked extensively on is looking at that relationship between migration and development. I think in a lot of policy circles, we often think of it as linear, right? People from poorer countries are going to move to where they can make higher wages, and that's a linear relationship. But what Michael has shown is that it's actually an S curve, in that when a country is developing and becoming a higher income country, people are more likely to emigrate because they're gaining education, they're looking for jobs, just as we all do, that match their skill sets, which typically aren't available in their country of origin. But at a certain point of development, that trend reverses. So once a country reaches generally between 8,000 to 10,000 purchasing power parity dollars, you see people are starting to find opportunities at home because they're available. And so what we're talking about here is that intermediary period while a country is developing, to facilitate those migration opportunities, to have those developing countries reach that point where the trend can decline and people can find fulfilling opportunities at home as well. The research has shown that in that intermediary period, there are economic benefits as well. The most clear example is through remittances, which for the Northern Triangle countries, for example, comprise more than 20% of their GDP, which is more than foreign direct investment, and clearly has a big impact, not just on consumption, but also on investment in education. So there was a study done in 2011 in El Salvador that showed that people who receive remittances were actually more likely to put their children, particularly girls, in school because the girls weren't busy tending to the cows or what have you. So not only can remittances benefit immediate consumption, but also improving the conditions for that next generation coming up to have opportunities for that second generation. And then lastly, we have seen that migration can facilitate a closer equilibrium in labor markets of countries of origin. So this is a bit backwards. There's a common critique of brain drain, which we saw was a big concern, particularly in the evacuation in Afghanistan. But this is a common critique that policymakers bring up in various corridors. But if you look at particular contexts, if the program is designed correctly, people who are emigrating mean that for those who stay home, there's less competition. You're more likely to get that job that your competitor was taking away from you before. And so when we design programs that are intentional for both countries of origin and destination, looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, demographic trends, we can ensure in that intermediary period that it's beneficial for everybody involved. Now, I do want to address the question that you asked about what does that look like? And the Center for Global Development does have a pie in the sky concept called global skill partnerships. This is in place between Belgium and Morocco, for example, but given the struggles in Congress, I don't think it's going to happen in the next few years. But what it could look like for people with university degrees is creating occupational shortage lists using the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Our European counterparts do this, and that is frequently updated to make sure that we are doing due diligence in respecting labor markets in countries of origin and destination. And conducting assessments, not just of the costs of migration pathways, but also realizing the potential investments as well. So my boss, Michael, has also done another study, particularly looking at the H2 program in North Carolina. And this is a somewhat anomaly because they have a particular structure called the North Carolina Growers Association that acts as the petitioning employer. And this allows for some movement among farms. But this particular case study showed that 7,000 foreign workers added between $248 and $381 million to the state's economy. And as a result of that, for each, this is an odd number because it's an economic study, doesn't really make real world sense all the time, but the calculations broke down to 1.5 foreign workers, H2 workers, did generate an additional job. And this is after conducting labor condition applications, which find that US workers aren't willing to fill the roles. The Economic Policy Institute has done some studies as well that compares the H2 program with BLS statistics. And it is clear we need to improve LCA conditions generally. But lastly, I do want to just touch on quickly for people without university degrees, which is quite common in developing countries and in particular to the Northern Triangle. It is very difficult for people to obtain a visa, particularly a work visa, without a university degree or a family member in the country. The H2 program is the primary program that allows for this type of movement, and we have seen a bipartisan consensus around the H2 program. This year, we saw the Biden administration issue a cap exemption above the 66,000 with a special allotment for nationality, which was new. But we have seen over the past, since fiscal year 2017, these special appropriations exemptions have been in the bill. So we do see some bipartisan consensus around the H2 program. And finally, I just want to highlight that in assuring that these pathways are available and accessible, we could potentially see a reduction in irregular migration. We did see this trend when issuing H2 visas, particularly to people in Mexico. There was a correlated decline in apprehensions. So it holds promise for opening these pathways in a reduction of irregular migration, not to mention the development impacts that I mentioned before. So I think everyone can agree that regular or legal immigration is better than illegal immigration, but it's just a matter of whether there is that opportunity to do so. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Riva. So I'm going to come back around to you, Cesar, because the Republicans historically have made a really big distinction between legal and illegal immigration, right? And yet they also have this big issue about border security. So we just heard from Riva and some from Leon and Chev that actually expanding some avenues for legal immigration could help with the border security and would move some of these folks into the legal channels. Do you think that's something that Republicans could embrace, or do you think that's, you know, there's counterweights to that make that argument challenging?
Yeah, so from now until election day 2022, no, I don't think that that's in the cards. I also think we need to, look at the real prospect that that House is going to flip and Republicans will be in the majority in the House, and we'll be facing a defensive battle where the House Republicans could pass legislation to reduce legal immigration. I don't know so back in the mid 1990s, when I worked for Senator Abraham, the Lamar Smith and Alan Simpson passed their immigration reform bill, which included a 30% cut in legal immigration. We were able to split the bill in the mid 1990s by putting together a coalition, a left-right coalition in opposition to that. We got a number of Republicans to support us. But if such a bill were to come over from the House next year, that cuts legal immigration over to the Senate, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure there's the voting bloc to preserve legal immigration going forward. So, not to be pessimistic, but I'm being pessimistic just based on the polling data I see and what Republicans are saying out there, on the campaign stuff.
So, Leon, let me come over to you. You mentioned the backlog recovery provisions, in the bill. Chev, you also mentioned the adjustment of status provisions. And yet, we saw, for example, Senator Menendez say, well, yeah, those provisions, those really benefit business. And we're really looking to make sure that the legalization pieces get in first. Do you see that as correct, or do you think that's just a prevalent view in the Democratic Party that these legal visa provisions are just primarily for business? I mean, these are people that are caught in the legal immigration backlogs. And it seems a little bit of sort of preferring certain types of immigrants over others. Do you think that's true, or do you think there's more nuance there?
I think there's a confusion, and it's because people don't do this every day, and so they get in and out of these issues. You have to always remember when you're talking about senators, they know a lot about immigration now, but they also are doing tax, and they're doing bankruptcy, whatever. They're doing a million issues, healthcare, blah blah blah, and so they have about the same level of expertise in all of these issues, which is just enough to be dangerous. But they're not, the policy wonks on any one of these particular issues. And so there is a reflexive thing that I think most members of Congress do, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, that when you're talking about employment-based green cards, they're thinking, oh, that's something that companies want. That has nothing to do with either helping actual immigrants or helping the system writ large. And what's interesting is, if you actually think about what is the best situation for companies, the best situation for companies, with an exception I'll talk about in a second, is what exists today, which is where it's very hard to leave your company and there's no free agency. And it's, you can do it, but it's hard. You have to get another company to agree. They have to agree to file paperwork. They have to pay money to do this. So there isn't the same level of being able to transfer people. And from the perspective of, if you were truly a greedy capitalist company, that's your ideal. A world where people are being pulled out of that and given green cards, which is what people are asking for now, is actually the second most American populist thing you can do. The first would be to ban all immigration. I get that. You want to do that, that's fine. You want to be the populist and ban all, you can do that. But the second best thing you can do, if you're not going to do that, is to at least put foreign workers at the same level playing field as American workers, so that it's not preferable to hire a foreign worker because they're tethered to people. Now, the problem that the companies are starting slowly but surely to grapple with is, if they don't do something soon, they are soon going to be at the point, we're not talking maybe now, but soon enough, where they have 80-year-old and 90-year-old workers sitting there at Amazon, sitting there at Google, sitting there at Intel, sitting there at Oracle. And now these companies have to decide, when that person, God forbid, needs kidney surgery or needs a new heart replacement or whatever exists then. Am I going to deport this person by kicking them out of their job and getting rid of their health care, because the second they're not working at Amazon, they're out, they're gone? Or am I carrying this 90-year-old person until the day they die, because that's the only way they're going to be able to stay in their company? That's where we're headed. That is a slow-moving train wreck that has no exaggeration to it whatsoever, because that's where the system is, because we're not solving the backlog of the green card problem. And so the question is, everybody then knows, okay, the solution to that is either, well, get all these people out of the country. I mean, that's one way you could solve that. But that's going to have a huge drain of human capital that we've already invested. And these people are doing amazing and tremendous things at all of these companies. Or give these individual green cards. And I think the problem continues to be that, at least on the Democratic side, the idea is, it feels like to some people, just reflexively, as sort of an anti-victory or a Pyrrhic victory to help this group, when you've gotten nothing in exchange for the undocumented population. I understand that. I don't sympathize with it at all, because I view every one of these people as having some form of suffering, where, if you look at it from their perspective, is equally bad in all of these forms. And I don't like to rank who's suffering more and who's suffering less and all of this. There's people, the stories you hear on all of these issues are terrible. But my point is, if you have a path to a solution on any of these issues, get it, grab it, move on, because we tried over and over and over and over and over again, banging against the wall, trying to get the whole path and solving everything, and we don't get it. So the point is, look, the times will change for different parts of this solution. There will be a time for DACA. There'll be a time for people in the backlog. There'll be a time for fixing to allow agricultural workers and there will be times for all of these things. So maybe it's just time to start grabbing what can be grabbed, because we've tried the other way so many times. I don't know. As big as a proponent I am conceptually of doing everything at once because everybody gets what they need out of it, people don't want to do that. So how can I force something on the people that they don't want to do? So if they don't want to do it, we have to come up with something else that people will want to do. And so
Yeah.
that's
So let me turn to Chev now, and maybe you can help the audience understand a little bit about where do these provisions stand in the reconciliation now. They're in the House bill that hasn't been voted on. There's been pieces of immigration that have been presented to the parliamentarian in the Senate. It's not clear whether these visa recapture provisions or the advanced adjustment status provisions have presented. Where do things stand to the best of your knowledge, and where do you think it might go? Do you think that these provisions are possible, likely, maybe? It's all up in the air. We don't know. What's your best guess?
I mean, it is all up in the air. It's really hard. I think the best bet is not ever assuming you know what Congress is going to do. But yes, they are in the House version of the reconciliation bill, and that is an important first step, right? That it's included, it's part of the discussion. To my knowledge, they still have not gone to the parliamentarian. But I think Leon had mentioned before that these are provisions that have previously gone forward with recapture. So there is some precedence there for these to go forward. I think they will, just based on the concerns that the parliamentarian had raised previously about lawful permanent residence and about the various registry and, well, not even registry, but the legalization programs. You know, these are very different. These are people who are already in line for permanent residence. They're qualified, but for the number, right? They just need the number. They're already in the process. So it's very different. And, you know, we'd be hopeful that if and when it does go to the parliamentarian, she would rule favorably on it. I did want to just go back and address one thing about, you know, this is like a big tech giveaway, right? And what people are missing is, one, the really important part, that the workers are individuals, they're human beings with family members, right? This is not actually for the employer's benefits, because once they do get it, as Leon said, the workers are then free to go work wherever they want. So that's one point. But two, this actually addresses family-based backlogs as well. People who are here are applying for family-based immigrant visa petitions are also going to benefit from the recapture provisions and the early adjustment of status provisions as well. So, you know, one thing that I look at it is that this may help sort of address that cycle of individuals who are forced to fall out of status or forced to come here unlawfully to be reunited with their families. So I do want to say, like, I think it's such a narrow view to say this is a big tech giveaway. This is going to help. This will help some of the DACA population. This will help some of the essential workers. It'll help the physicians. It'll help the tech workers. It'll help everybody who's in line. And I think we need to remember that this, even if we get just this, quote unquote, just this, it will make a big difference. And I think it's an important provision that needs to be talked about as something that helps everybody.
Thank you. All right, we have about 5 minutes left, and I kind of want to go back real quick to Cesar and Leon and ask each of you. I mean, you've both sort of said, look, the current political situation is not beneficial to like really getting a lot of stuff done. But what do you think would change any of those incentives? I mean, Cesar, you've seen different polling as have I and Leon. I mean, the public's not against any of this stuff necessarily. I mean, they can be made to seem against it depending on how a question is asked. But is there a way to sort of move the needle in the parties to push back towards some bipartisanship? You know, the electoral incentives, I think they have continued to be jammed in that direction, mainly by the people in office pushing it. But how do we realign the incentives to kind of get back to a place where we can have some of these better conversations? What do you guys think is the best option there? I don't know, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll go first, and let me agree with Leon, that big is not necessarily better. I mean, we've tried the big comprehensive reform before. It was actually a good bill that our bosses drafted, but the bigger immigration legislation gets, the more it creates pockets of opposition, and you never get anywhere. So I totally agree that the solution is to take it piecemeal and sequentially. And like Leon says, whatever can command the most support, let's go with it. But I will say for Republicans, I mean, this is from moderates down to the most conservative. Something has to be done with the border situation first before we get to any of these other issues, which they may agree with. They may agree with pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and beyond. They may agree with a guest worker program and other things that we've discussed here. But until you get that border situation controlled, I just don't see Republicans moving, particularly not before the next year's elections, the midterms.
Yeah. So Leon, turning to you, I mean, one of the reasons Democrats are going through reconciliation is because that was the discussion in the bipartisan talks before reconciliation started. And Democrats said, no, we don't want to talk about the border issues. You heard Caesar, that's something that voters actually really want to see done. Do you think that's something that could hurt Democrats if they're not willing to at least have that conversation?
Let me try to end on an optimistic note, just because that's my nature.
Okay.
Say this. Maybe there's a way, if essentially what happens is you have the Supreme Court continue to say you have to remain in Mexico. And so then you have to do this now. This is what you have to do. So at that point, the Biden administration says to itself, okay, we've got to remain in Mexico because the Supreme Court's not changing anytime soon. So the question is, what does that look like? And can we extract a bill that operationalizes remain in Mexico in a humanitarian way where people actually have safe conditions, access to counsel, all of these things? Because again, I'm not saying anybody wants to do this in the Democratic Party. I'm saying if the Supreme Court makes them do it and starts throwing people in jail if they don't do it, then you generate a win out of that. And then maybe, like Caesar says, you go and you add DACA to it and you put those two things together. And then that literally is your border solution, because if people can't come in the country unless they've won asylum, and that's where we're headed, then try to get a legislative victory in exchange for that. So again, I'm not saying there's any Democrat right now thinking that far ahead or even wanting this outcome, but one could actually see this if you have a Supreme Court decision striking DACA and a Supreme Court decision mandating remain in Mexico forever, you have to do this, then why not? Why couldn't you put those two things together and actually get a bipartisan deal on that? So there's my one piece of optimism.
Here we go. We know that you guys, if put in a room together, could come up with legislation, because you did. And we'd love it if we could get Congress to sit in a room together and try to work some of this stuff out. We're out of time, but I want to thank everyone so much. Riva, Leon, Caesar, Chev, thank you so much for contributing to this discussion. We at BPC will continue to talk about these issues and find ways that we can, in narrow ways, big ways, we don't care, that we can get people together to address bipartisanship, particularly in immigration, because it's been so long since we've been able to get things done. Please, 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 you'll get a survey in the mail if you've registered for this program. We appreciate your feedback on the program, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.